Um, and I know we got some more people that will be jumping in throughout the meeting. Just so you know, my name is Danny Solar. I'm the principal over at Wakanda Middle School. And I know we also have Mr. Taturka, the principal over at Matthews Middle School. And today we're going to be having a presentation from Jackie Rue. She's going to be going over anxiety. And again, this is going to be recorded so that if anybody wants to see it later, they're able to see the entire presentation. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jackie.
Hey, thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. I'm super excited to be here again, just to have some conversation. As Dan said, I'm Jackie Rue, and one of the things I love most is talking to families and parents. If you can, just mute yourselves if your microphone is on, and I don't know, Dan, if you can maybe help with the muting feature,
Yeah,
just so there's no background sound. But I've been in the field for about 25 years, consulting with schools and working with parents and teenagers and children. And one of the things I love most is just learning, and so that I can share what I learn. And so tonight the focus is going to be on anxiety, signs, symptoms, and interventions. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. There is a chat feature on here, and those of you that are able, there's going to be a few times during the presentation that I'm going to ask you to use the chat feature. Keep the dialogue pertinent to what we're talking about if you can. I will share my contact information at the end. And if you have any follow-up questions or you want to ask more specific questions about your child or children, feel free to do that as well. But I want to just start off here and start the night as, you know, kind of applauding you all for being here, whether you're here on this or you're listening later, because I think one of the things I've learned having both my kids are adults now, and parenting is one of the most rewarding jobs, but it's also stressful and even difficult at times. I had one mom say to me yesterday, Jackie, is it horrible that I'm super excited that my child's about to move out of the house? And we laughed and we talked about that as much as we love our children, sometimes it's difficult and sometimes we worry. And so I want to start tonight by just taking a couple minutes, and I'd like each of us just to do a little self-check-in about where we're at tonight, just in terms of our own stress levels, our own anxieties, our own fears, and kind of just sit for a moment and really think about, you know, how you're doing. And one of the questions I want to ask is, and it's focused on self-care, are you taking the time each day to practice one or two little tidbits of self-care, whether it's, you know, just taking a minute break, whether it's, you know, sitting outside or taking a quick walk. It was interesting. I can tell that it's starting to get lighter later, because I was out around 4:15 today for a little bit of a jog, and I saw tons of people. You would have thought it was springtime, but everybody was out walking their dog and just so excited that there was some sun. I want you just to put in the chat some way that you engage in self-care each week. And if you can do that, I'm gonna kind of full circle it. We're gonna talk a little bit about why this piece is so important. But as parents, if we're not taking care of ourselves, we are not going to be able to take care of our kids, and we're not going to be able to have a good judgment in terms of our reactions. So please just take a second in the chat, and I'd like you just to write one way that you've engaged in self-care today. One thing that you do, one self-care practice. Working out daily, getting some sunshine. And this is especially important to try to get some sunshine, because there isn't tons of it in the winter. So when you see it, you want to get out. Running is another great one. Exercise, that's awesome. A lot of movement. The other thing I'm going to add is we're modeling for our kids, so that when we're taking care of ourselves, they see that, and that is going to be key. You know, if you have other ones, I know for some of us, spend a little time by myself. Often I hear parents say things to me like, I don't have time for self-care. It can be even stepping in the bathroom for 1 minute and just focusing on your breathing and just focusing on just taking a moment to breathe. Probably if you reflect on the last time you found yourself yelling at your child or really frustrated, you could probably full circle it, tie it back to your stress levels. When we're stressed and we're emotional, we're not always the best version of ourselves. And I know as a parent, every day looks different. We're doing the best we can. We're not always going to be our best versions of ourselves. Our kids are resilient. There's no perfect parent, despite what social media said. But this self-care piece is going to be huge. And so I want you to think about, if you don't have a way that you engage in self-care, or you're not sure on what you do for yourself, I want you to think about that, because that's going to be huge. There is actually something called parental anxiety. And parental anxiety is, and I actually, I work a lot with parents around this. There's something called parental anxiety. And parental anxiety is when, as a parent, you find yourself consumed with worry. You're worried about your child. You're imagining that if your child is not with you, that they could be needing you and you're not there for them. You're concerned that maybe your child's in a situation, maybe they're sitting by themselves at lunch if school's in session. Maybe they're having a frustration or they're having an issue, but you're not there, and you worry about that. You might be worried that your child's not going to be able to manage a situation, or that your child possibly is going to be sad or upset, and you're not going to be able to fix that. There might be some truth in your worry. There might be some validity. There might be some reasons to worry. But parental anxiety has to do with when that worry overcomes us and we tend to react out of that worry. And so we're going to touch on that a little bit. And for some of us parents that are already struggling with anxiety disorders, we might be more prone to that. For some of us that possibly had traumatic situations happen in our childhood or in the past, we might be more at risk for parental anxiety. All parents have anxiety about their kids to some degree, but parental anxiety is more when it overtakes you, when you find that you're consumed by it. During this time of uncertainty, it's caused an extra layer. So for many parents, it's caused extra worry. Is my child going to be okay? Is my child going to miss out? Has my child regressed? Is my child going to have the same social relationships maybe he or she had before? What are things going to look like? And for many of us, uncertainty causes extra anxiety and extra worry. And I am what they call an anxiety specialist. I treat anxiety on a regular basis. And in fact, anxiety is one of the most treatable disorders there is. It's pretty predictable and easy to treat. So we're gonna go through that a little bit tonight as well. And I'm going to provide some tips and tools. And again, if I don't answer all of the questions tonight, we will, I'll give my contact information so you can follow up with me. But, and I used this analogy when I was with you all before, but I want you to think for a minute, if you're on an airplane and there's a ton of turbulence and you're the passenger, your anxiety is going to heighten. And who are you going to look to assess the situation, right? You're going to look to the flight attendant because you're not going to see the pilot, and you're going to look to the flight attendant and you're going to want them to be more neutral, more calm, more in control. And so often our kids look to us as parents. And this is something that really resonated with me when I was parenting, because so often, and I'm going to be honest with you, I struggled with anxiety parenting. I really, really had to find my calm, because for me, if I wasn't careful, I would find myself reacting out of emotion versus reacting out of my purpose. What are my goals? What are things that I really want to teach my child? And what I found is I wanted my child to know that it was okay to not be okay. I wanted my child to know that they weren't supposed to be happy all the time, that they're supposed to be sad and anxious and angry and fearful, and that feelings are normal, and we want our kids to learn to tolerate feelings. It's when we have kids that are older that they get upset and they totally fall apart is where I get concerned. So you all that have elementary and middle school children are in a really great place to start to look at, how do we send a message to our kids that it's expected to have really challenging times. I was on a conversation actually with someone earlier this week. It was actually a news reporter, and they're doing a story on anxiety during this time. And one of the things we talked about, if there's a silver lining in this pandemic, it's going to be that our children are learning to do things different and they're learning to be resilient. That this has thrown everybody for a loop. And I'm sure everyone on this call can think of someone they know that has gone to that totally catastrophic place of this is terrible, this is awful, this isn't going to work. How could they make that decision? This is the worst ever. When you see that, you know somebody's really struggling and they're operating out of that emotion versus being able to take a step back and kind of look at things a little bit more rationally. But our kids are learning during this time to be resilient. And if you've looked at other times in history where there's been, while not the exact same situation, but huge crises, right? We see that out of those situations, we see kids become more resilient. We see them learn to deal with things a little bit differently. And things have definitely gotten shaken up. And so if there is a silver lining, I think that is one. On the first slide here, as we go into the first slide, we're going to talk about the difference between stress and anxiety. And so when we started this call, I asked you to think about where you're at tonight and think about your own stress levels. Think about just different stressors you're dealing with and how you're tackling those stressors. Because I think so often we have to be mindful. And I can give you all great advice because I've made every mistake under the sun with my own kids. And so luckily my kids are adults now, so I can share all this words of wisdom with you. But be mindful of how you're reacting to stress and your perspective on your stress. And sometimes I think as parents, we have a tendency to project our experience onto our children. So we have to be careful not to project onto them what we're experiencing. Just because something is difficult for you, don't assume that it's necessarily going to be difficult for your child. But if you look and say, this is really difficult, your child's going to pick up on that. So they're going to look to you. So if it's a stress, you will notice. And I joke, and I said this last time when I was here, I have 2 adult kids, and the hardest part for me is they act just like me in every way. They cope how I cope. They have learned because behaviorally they have watched me. And so if you want to teach your child something really neat, you have to model it. Think about how you manage stress is going to be huge. And some of you are balancing a ton. You might have to let some things go. If you're a perfectionist, now is not the time to be a perfectionist. Now is the time to really set realistic expectations for yourself. You can't do everything. So if you're working and you're teaching and you have kids at home and you're doing e-learning, every day think about what's realistic and be kind to yourself. You know, watch that the critical thinking, because when we're stressed and anxious, we typically tend to have very critical thoughts. And I'm going to touch on that. We tend to be very, very black and white, all or nothing. This is terrible. This is awful. This is going to be the worst ever. It's not going to work. When we're stressed and we don't manage the stress well, when we don't deal with our stress well, it turns into anxiety. We also have other anxieties, which we're going to talk about, fears and things like that. But when you don't manage your stress and you're just going, you're going to see heightened anxiety. When I work with high school kids and they have 8 AP classes and they're playing sports and they're not taking any breaks, and the parents bring them to my office and they say they're anxious, you need to fix the anxiety. How can I fix the anxiety if they have too much stress on their plate, or if they can't manage what's in front of them in a healthy way? So look at your stress levels. And if you are carrying a lot, if you've got a lot on your plate and you're feeling really anxious, kind of say to yourself, I should feel this way. I'm juggling all this. What are ways I can engage in self-care? What are ways that I can ask for help and reach out for supports? New is uncomfortable. New things are uncomfortable. When this whole thing started and we shifted to e-learning, for many of us, we were uncomfortable. And our first thought was, this is different, so it's not going to work. You know, I think that although there are elements that have worked and elements that haven't, and for every child it looks different, the fact is, I guarantee you, the one thing I learned is if you have kids, they will struggle at different points. And the best thing I did as a parent is to teach my kids how to struggle really well and how to bounce back when that happens, because your kids will struggle. And we want them to learn how to manage it and gain confidence so they can. But new is uncomfortable. any new situation. And for some kids, it's even more challenging. I think the hardest part during this pandemic has been those kids that joined a school for the first time, and they were new to the school, or this was totally a new experience for them. New is uncomfortable. And if you have a child that's dealing or struggles with new situations, or possibly has a belief that I can't handle a new situation, now's the time to practice that with them. How can we practice new situations? How can we practice doing things new, and figure out that we can handle that? Success versus perfection. What do you consider success for your children each day? And I ask this to teachers too when I speak with teachers. What do you consider success to look like? When you think about your child, what do you consider success for this week to look like for them? Maybe they're struggling with school and engaging in school. So maybe success isn't going to be that they log on to every single class and do every assignment. Maybe success is going to look a little bit different for them today or this week. You know, I work with kids a lot, and there was actually, I was talking to somebody that wrote an article earlier this week, and he said there's a whole group of kids that think their love that they receive from others is based on what they achieve. And if they're not achieving, they're not worthy of love. So they tie love to achievements. And so it's interesting when you look at those kids that are highly perfectionistic, those kids, that group especially, and I work with a lot of them, it's key to work with them on what does success look like, and how do we set even realistic expectations. And I'm going to talk about how this leads to anxiety, because on the next slide, so when we think about anxiety, we've all had anxiety. We've all experienced anxiety, and you want to have some anxiety for performance. So I work a lot with athletes. And so one of the things we talk about is how can you use anxiety to your benefit? When is it maladaptive? When is anxiety something that's hindering us? And when is anxiety something that's helpful? So like I said earlier, anxious people don't tend to worry that everything's going to go really great and it's going to be a wonderful day and they're going to win the lottery and everyone's going to be their friend. Anxious people tend to worry about the worst case situation. We call it black and white thinking, all or nothing thinking. Nothing's going to work. This is going to be terrible. This is going to be horrible. And you might have kids that are very, very black and white. And depending on their age, some of that is a little bit normal. And part of that, we have to teach them how to flip those thoughts and reframe. You know, when we're anxious, our thoughts are a symptom of our anxiety. So it's normal to have anxious thoughts when you're anxious, but we have to recognize that just because you have an anxious thought doesn't mean that it's true, doesn't mean that it's reality. It just means that it's a symptom of your anxiety. Sometimes when people are dealing with severe depression, they might have thoughts that are related to the depression. And so we teach in the clinic, we teach our patients to be able to recognize, is that a rational thought, or is that what we call a thought distortion? Is that something that's more related to your anxiety? Like, this won't get better, or this always happens to me, or I did a terrible job. Emotional distress is when, you know, you're just feeling just overwhelmed with all the emotions and just consumed. And especially for little kids, anxiety is physically uncomfortable. And that is one of the hardest things about anxiety, is it's physically uncomfortable. So when we're in an anxious state, you might carry it in your upper back. I know when I carry a lot of stress that leads to anxiety, I feel it up here. I feel it in my upper back, more so when I'm stressed. If I'm more anxious about a situation, I might carry it more in my stomach. For some, they get headaches. Some get muscle tightness. And this is why it's so key that we work with athletes, because when they're feeling a lot of stress and anxiety, they tend to tighten up their muscles and they're more prone to injury. So we have to be more even like on target with them to make sure we're working on this. But I teach the kids I work with that we do have physical symptoms of anxiety. And so often our physical symptoms set an alarm off in our brain, which causes us to think certain thoughts, again, those black and white thinking thoughts, that can then lead to a behavior, which is typically to avoid the very thing that makes you anxious. When I was in school, when I was a child, and I don't know if anyone can relate to this, I had an extreme phobia of public speaking. I would have said I was the worst case you'd ever seen. I was the worst. Nobody else had anxiety. And we call anxiety the special complex, because when you're anxious, you feel like it's all about you. No one else can relate. You're so anxious. You have the worst situation. You're that special that it's so different for you than everyone else. I had the worst case in my mind. So what did I do? I avoided every opportunity there was to public speak because it caused me anxiety and it caused me to feel physically sick. But as you know, if you've thought about anything that's ever made you anxious, the more you avoid what makes you anxious, the more anxious you get. And then you start to lack confidence and you start to develop a belief, I can't handle this. It's not going to work. I'm not good enough for this. And then you avoid some more and you seek a lot of people to provide you reassurance. So what I had to do is I had to make a decision. And at that time, I made a decision that I wanted to try to do something different. You know, the whole don't try harder, don't do the same thing over and over, do something different. So I started to put myself out there. I started to do presentations because frankly, when I was in high school and middle school, they didn't really give us a choice. I don't even think we had accommodations. We just had to kind of do it. And so I did it, but I had to realize that it was okay if I wasn't okay. And I had to realize that I could be okay if other people weren't happy with my performance, if people gave me criticism. So you will see me practicing with kids. I will actually we'll practice accepting criticism. We'll practice what that's like. And I would do it over and over again until I felt more comfortable. That is really the research evidence-based practice, how to treat something having to do with an anxiety phobia. It's called exposure therapy. If you have kids that have anxiety and you have a therapist that says, we'll help them avoid whatever makes them anxious and tell them they're going to be okay every day, you will notice that that's not going to help the anxiety. We have, when I treat them in the clinic, I have kids come in, even younger children, and I have them talk about, different scenarios, and I might write them on a piece of paper and have them circle, have them recognize and identify every situation that causes them to be uncomfortable, might have them circle, draw pictures, and then we practice doing those things that cause them to be uncomfortable. So that's kind of the evidence base. There's not a lot of varying treatments for anxiety. It comes down to, and on the next slide, you'll see that it is going to be about understanding those situations that cause your child to be uncomfortable, but also understanding how you as a parent respond when your child's uncomfortable. So if you see your child, and here's an example, let's say it's a typical school year, you're picking your child up from school, they're walking out the school door and your child looks sad. How many of you would start to get anxious? How many of you would start to worry? And for many of us parents, and I can relate to this, the first thing that we want to say to our child is, what's wrong? And this is where it gets a little sticky, because you might be feeling extra emotional that day. The child might not even be sad. The child might be making that facial expression. You and the child might have a dynamic where every day the child gets in the car and you ask what's wrong, and that's kind of where the child's kind of responding to you asking. There's a lot of things that we're not positive about. So one thing I encourage parents to do is when they see the child look sad, as opposed to leading with a leading question like what's wrong, take a step back and maybe just allow the child to talk about his or her day. If you know your child, I had one mom and she said she struggled with anxiety. She actually sat outside the playground and she watched her child. And when her child wasn't playing with anyone, she got really, really anxious and she was really, really upset. She would call the school and she said she just couldn't tolerate that. And we talked about how it was more about her than it was the child. So think about all those situations that cause your child to be uncomfortable, and then think about how whether or not that triggers any anxiety in you. And do you typically respond out of anxiety, or can you take a step back and allow your child to be uncomfortable and work through that a little bit? How do you typically respond when your child's anxious? As we're going to talk about tonight, as parents, we typically, and we all do this, so this is about me just sharing what I've learned, not about us being critical. typically as parents, we want to reassure our kids. We want to make them feel better. However, if you have a child that's anxious, that is going to prolong and heighten their anxiety. You want to avoid saying to an anxious child, don't worry, it's going to be fine. Everything's going to be fine. It's going to be great. We want to normalize for kids that they can deal with situations that aren't great and that it doesn't have to be great all the time. Gosh, this might be really hard. What could you do? Who could you ask for help from? Avoid reassurance with kids that are anxious. That's probably one of the biggest dynamics that causes problems for kids is when parents start to really feel sorry for their kids and they reassure or they overly react, even if it's overly complimenting them, like you're so wonderful, you're so amazing, you could do anything in the world. Overly complimenting kids oftentimes can lead to more anxiety. It doesn't typically lead to confidence. Our children will gain confidence when they learn that they can do things that are difficult for them, when they can learn that they can manage being uncomfortable. And I love how you all agree at the beginning, because as we know, sometimes our kids are not anxious. They're feeling a different emotion, and we're just chalking it up to anxiety because we're feeling anxious. So that's just something to keep in mind. Do we reinforce avoidant behavior or do we maintain expectations? This is a challenging one, but I can tell you in working with just hundreds and hundreds of families and kids, this one will be key and help you. If you think about the expectations that you have for your child, do you change those expectations if you feel like they're shy or they're anxious or they can't handle things, or do you kind of hold those expectations? You want to be mindful not to reinforce avoidant behavior. So if you have a child, and I can't tell you how many parents have said to me, well, they can't do that because they're anxious, or they acted that way because they're anxious. And I think if you find yourself saying that, take a step back and look at what that's about for you. We've had a lot of interventions that were really simple, that really made a huge difference. So I had a mom of a third grader, and he was having a lot of different eating behaviors at the dinner table. And he was an anxious child. He was a kid that had a lot of anxiety. But the problem is, the more he engaged in these eating behaviors, like he wouldn't use a fork because he was too anxious to use a fork, and he was moving his food around. The dad would get really angry, and the dad would respond. And the more the dad responded, the more the child engaged in the behaviors. So mom would get really upset because mom said he's just so anxious. He can't eat the way his siblings eating. So we talked about, instead of focusing on the anxiety, focus on the expectations around the table that everybody had, and look at situations that the child tends to do a little bit better versus situations that the child struggles. On the next slide, and again, what heightens anxiety? If you want to make somebody more anxious, help them avoid whatever makes them anxious. So think about the situations that cause the child or your child to be uncomfortable. And sometimes I won't even use the word anxiety with kids. I'll use the word uncomfortable, because I think we tend to overuse that word anxiety today. What are situations that cause you to be uncomfortable? For some kids, it's, being the center of attention. For some kids, it's showing up late. For some kids, it's making a mistake. Some kids, it's getting sick. Vomit is a big one. Storms and bugs and heights. Sometimes new situations, it can be separation anxiety, leaving a parent. Think about situations that cause your child to be uncomfortable. The key here is going to be thinking about how you respond. Do you have a tendency to jump ahead of it and kind of over reassure before they're going into that situation? Do you have a tendency to over ask if they're okay? I started the school refusal program at Amita Health, and one of the things I found with kids with school anxiety in school refusal is I used to actually have to go out to the car to get them, because they would be in the car with the parent, and the parent will call me and say they're screaming, they're yelling, and they're so anxious they can't get out of the car. I would actually physically go to the car, and one of the things I would do is I was able to have an easier time with kind of helping the kids to come in, because I wasn't the parent, so I could stay calm, where the parent by that point would be really, really upset and of course emotional. So I would have the parent move aside, and I simply kind of gave the child some directives and got him in. And typically, and I didn't touch him or anything like that, but I was just calm. And typically what I found is when I talk less and just kind of relay the expectations, kids with anxiety tend to do better, right? Kids with anxiety do better with less talking, expectations, and structure. And so when a parent says to me, my child can't handle expectations, we talk about how kids, especially with anxiety, tend to do better when there are expectations. That's why they tend to do better, not maybe going to school, but once they're in the building, they tend to do better because school is a little bit structured. You want to avoid saying things like, it'll be great, don't worry about it, you'll be fine. What are things, we're going to talk about different coping strategies for kids. And we don't need to always distract them from their anxiety, allowing them just to feel different feelings. Some parents will use different feeling cards and things like that. Even for little kids to tap into, okay, you're sad or you're frustrated, but that's okay. And what are things you can do, because mom and dad aren't always there or sister's not always there. On the next slide, just some key skills. When I started the school anxiety program, I knew that the kids that came in our door, there were 3 things that I wanted them to learn before they left. And these are kids 8 to 18. I wanted the kids in the program to know that it was okay to be uncomfortable, but I wanted to teach them throughout the 3-week program to be comfortable being uncomfortable. I wanted them to learn that their body does respond to anxiety, but there are ways that we can really bring our own stress and anxiety levels down. I wanted the kids that came through the program to learn how to communicate what they need. How do you ask for help? How do you let somebody know what you need in problem solving skills? How do you, and again, this is going to look different at every age, but how do you look at something and instead of saying, I got nothing, how do you kind of look at different ways? There was, I had just recently, I worked with 2 middle school kids on one middle school girl who was a little bit more of a perfectionist. We did what's called a success journal, where I had her write down different successes each day that she felt she had. Another child, I think it was in 5th grade, wrote down like a problem solving journal where every day he had to identify something that was hard for him and one way that he worked through it, so that he could start to see that every day he was handling different situations and he was coming up with solutions. So think about that. And I love when parents say to kids, well, what do you think you could do? I mean, I could give you ideas all day long, but like, what do you think you could do? And what have you tried? What have you tried? And allowing them to make mistakes, but letting them gain confidence that they can try things. And especially even during the e-learning. On the next slide, the overall goal, I think, for most of us parents is really just helping build that resiliency, right? We want our kids to be emotionally healthy. We want them to be resilient. And your child might be really struggling right now. I had a parent say to me in one of the last parent meetings I had with them is, you don't understand, my child really can't handle a lot. Think for a couple of minutes how you would describe your child, and you may have multiple children at home. Think about how you describe each one and why you would describe them that way. And do you have a tendency to respond to them based on how you would describe them? And part of this I learned because I found myself, because I have 2 girls a year apart, and I shared this before, I found myself being more kind of rushing in to rescue my younger one because I saw her as more shy and anxious, and I had a tendency with my older one to push her a little bit. And so I had to recognize that because I saw them so differently, I had a tendency to respond. So often I had to kind of take a step back and just ask myself, was I responding more about my own emotional stuff going on, or was I responding more out of kind of the situation that was happening? Allowing kids to just even name their emotions. If you have a kid that you consider anxious, you want to avoid calling everything anxiety and saying things like, you look so anxious, you're so anxious, you must be anxious. Are you anxious about going today? It's very easy for us as parents to make a kid anxious. And so we want to be careful that we're not kind of creating anxiety for them. I had a mom and she was driving her kid to school and the kid had school anxiety. and she kept asking the kid if they were going to be okay. Well, you can tell where that probably went, right? Because if you ask an anxious kid too many times if they're going to be okay, what's going to happen is they're going to be more anxious and they're not going to be okay. So avoid saying, are you going to be okay, if you can? And just listen, allow them to listen. But if your child's not behaving in a way that is appropriate or that you feel like fits with your expectations, take a look at that. If your child's emotional or you're emotional, you want to take a step back and let people in the room just kind of calm for a second, because when we're emotional, that's when we tend to fight or argue. I've gotten a lot of calls from parents really frustrated with their kids playing video games and things like that. If you feel like you can't limit video games from your children and you feel like your child's kind of running the show, or you're not able to set limits because the child's reactions are so huge, there's so much support out there right now. These are things that you want to try to tweak, because typically kids with anxiety do better with structure. They do better with expectations. But so often as parents, we worry about our kids, so we take those expectations off. And just teaching healthy coping strategies. If you if you want your child to learn how to cope in healthy ways, just be modeling it for them. Model how to engage in that self-care, taking time for yourself, taking time for your friends. This may be more challenging now than ever, so we have to do creative things. I know some families have even created just different toolkits for each person in the family and talked about how you can use these toolkits when we're experiencing different stress during this time. Or if you have a child that's struggling with being on the computer for class, how they can take breaks and different ways. Some kids, they do well with like standing. They don't do well with sitting. Some parents will use ironing boards and put the school on the ironing board just so the child can stand and move it up and down. Lots of different ways. And then on the next slide, purposeful parenting is going to be something that you will hear me talk a lot about. I wrote a book with another author last year, Successful Parenting. And we really talked about just taking a look at what your goals are as a parent. What are you trying to teach your child through your parenting? I know for me, it was important. I wanted to teach my child just confidence that, they could deal with situations, new situations, in difficult situations, and they could deal with things not working out. For me, that was a challenge, because I, as a parent, especially as a parent that can have anxiety, had a tendency to want to rush in and rescue. And I had to kind of ask myself, is this more about me, or is this reaction more about what I'm trying to accomplish? And I think so often we'll find ourselves as parents just taking a step back and saying, okay, this is more about me. How are we reacting to those situations where our child is having a hard time? And if you have really strong feelings about something and you have really strong opinions, just be careful how you're projecting that. Your kids can hear you; they can hear your conversations. They're smart. Even the little ones, 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, they pick up on things. So be careful what you're saying, especially when you're in front of them. Kids really do absorb a lot. And that can be tough during this time when we do have so many strong feelings about things. Partner with your school. You want your child to see that you are working in conjunction with the school, especially during this time. If you don't agree with something or you're having a hard time with something, just try to keep that separate so that the child doesn't pick up on that. And putting things in perspective. I do believe that our kids are learning a lot of different things during this time. And sometimes it's about just doing a quick reality check. One thing I like to do is just whenever I'm stressed, I like to just sit and think about what are the facts, what's the evidence, try to take a little bit of perspective, think about difficult situations I've gone through in the past, and just remember that I was able to work through those, and I'm able to work through things now. The self-care piece, I can't stress enough. This part is going to be huge, and I share this. I had a situation last year with a very sick relative, and I had a decision to make, and I said, I can't control the situation I'm in, but I know if I want to be able to take care of someone else, I have to figure out a way to take care of myself. So I had to be mindful of what we call the basics. We call the basics making sure that you're getting good nutrition, you're sleeping at least 6 or 7 hours if you can, hygiene, connecting to healthy people. If you have people in your life that are bring you down, or you feel like maybe you have a neighbor that is always complaining about the school, or she's always complaining about something, you recognize that when you're with that person, you feel more, maybe put some separation. Part of self-care is finding those people in your life that can really help you to feel better, as opposed to those people that kind of bring you down. Self-care can also be just doing something nice for yourself every day. If you, as a parent, and we all at some point feel like we're screwing our kids up, rest assured that you're not. There's no perfect parent. There's no one way to do it. We're all going to make lots of mistakes together, and really just keep plugging along. But our kids, every little mistake we make, they're not going to remember it, and they're not going to be impacted by it. And so my goal for all of our kids during this time is to remember how we responded and how we were there for them. They're not going to remember all the details of which days they went to school. They're not going to remember whether, they're going to remember how we responded. They're going to remember how we jumped in and did virtual Zoom calls, and how we were able to do trunk and treat Halloweens, and how we were able to, even though things were crazy, we were able to be that stable force that kept plugging along, even though it was hard. And that's where I think we're really going to see the resiliency really fly with these kids. And then on the next slide, just some different strategies. Maybe think of 1 or 2 goals that you really want to work on with your kids. Maybe you are recognizing, I'm dealing with a lot of anxiety, and there's a lot of things going on for me. Encourage you to reach out as a parent. Even if you have to have 1 or 2 sessions with someone, get some support for yourself, because I think it's huge. So often when we tap into what's going on for us, it can really make a difference in our parenting, and our kids will pick up on that. Structure is going to be huge. You don't have to have a ton of structure in your home, but just have some consistency. Maybe something that you do the same every day. Maybe have like something fun that you do each week. You don't want to just totally excuse it and say, well, my child's, this is a difficult time. They're feeling lonely, so I'm going to have them, play Xbox for 6 hours a day, or be on the iPad all the time with talking to the neighbor. We know that they're on the computers and electronics enough with school, and so want to make sure we're having time for engagement, maybe playing a board game. Many kids will tell me they feel like there's not enough one-on-one time where they can just be with adults not on devices. That's going to be key. Recognize patterns. There's been many times during my raising my kids, my parenting years, where I've had to ask for help or talk to somebody and get some support. We're humans. We're going to struggle at different times. We need to support each other. But if you recognize there's something getting in the way for you of achieving your parenting goals, or kind of parenting in a way that you would like, reach out. And then on the next slide, I'm going to share some just some coping skills that you can share with your child, or that you can use for yourself. There's many mindfulness apps and games that they have now for kids. Mindfulness is just really about, slowing things down and learning to be in the moment. And again, if you have a lot of anxiety or different, even just racing thoughts, it can be hard to slow down. And so mindfulness is just really about learning to be in the present. With kids, we do things like grounding techniques, playing games with their 5 senses, and learning when you're feeling overwhelmed to just sit for a moment and think about, what do you see, smell, hear, taste, and touch. Some kids have little tactile things that they'll have at their desk or during their e-learning, just to focus on just sitting and grounding for a minute. It gives their mind a brain break for maybe even 30 seconds to a minute. Kids need to recognize that if you are feeling heightened emotional responses, it doesn't go away in 2 seconds. It takes about a minute or 2. So sometimes with kids, I'll even use a timer to show them, and they'll kind of see visually their levels going down. There's lots of muscle relaxation. And then this last one, which I shared last time I was with you, just, we have to learn to behave our way to feeling better. visualize kind of how you want to behave in the situation. And when you're feeling really overwhelmed or emotional, sometimes it's about, just visualizing and then behaving your way to that ending that you're trying to get. We work on all of these with our kids. Make sure that your kids, even the younger ones, have different things that they can do so that they can have some different things that they can practice. And again, if you recognize that there's certain situations that cause them anxiety, think about how you respond, and also really make note of praising or responding them for being able to bounce back and deal with things different. So if you're concerned that your child has test anxiety, for instance, and I've had a lot of kids that have performance anxiety and test anxiety, you want to be careful around saying things like, you're so bright, you're so amazing, you do so well at stuff, because a lot of those kids that have performance and test anxiety, they hear that as I need to be perfect or I need to do really well. For a lot of kids, we talk about it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to not do well on something. How do we bounce back? And when you notice your child struggling with something, really notice like, hey, I'm so impressed that you just bounced back from that. Like, even though you had that really difficult class, you still went to the next one. And I really like how you made that mistake and you worked through it versus, gosh, you screwed up again. Why did you screw up? The teacher gave you all the information. It's about what we respond to. And then on the next one, it's, this is the last one. And so I did want to leave some time for questions. And I know this is a lot of information. One of the things that we do at the anxiety clinic at the hospital and in my center is we're routinely practicing what's called exposure therapy with anxiety, is where people expose themselves to the very things that cause them anxiety until they start to see that the more you practice, the more you develop that idea of, wow, if I practice, I can actually get better, versus this is something that I can't do. And so if you have a child that's worried that they're not good at something or they can't do something, teach them that if the more they practice it, the more they're going to see that improvement. Not all kids are going to be motivated. And so that's where it gets a little bit difficult. So I am going to put the chat on. And then if you have any questions, feel free to ask a question in the chat, and if it's really related to what we're talking about especially, and I would love to answer it if you have any.
So at this time, if anyone wants to write in a chat, or if they would like to just turn off their mic, I know we're going to go into the questions, so I'm going to stop the recording so that we have this presentation to put up on the website.